Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. Our guests today are Nellie Cohen and Dan Kurzrock. Nellie Cohen holds over 20 years of sustainability experience and is widely recognized as a leading figure within the circular economy movement. Prior to founding Baleen, a specialized agency that focuses on circular design and implementation, Nellie spent nearly a decade at Patagonia as the architect of the brand's precedent-setting and award-winning circularity program, Worn Wear. Over her career, she has worked with some of the world's best-known brands, including Levi's, Target, Lululemon, Doen, Ergobaby, Fisher-Price, and Canada Goose on building circular business models, product systems, and the related marketing and communications. Her focus is to help brands reduce their environmental footprint while generating revenue and brand loyalty. Nellie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And I'm also joined by Dan Kurzrock. Dan's the co-founder, and chief grain officer of Upcycled Foods, Inc., which is DBA Regrained, and a passionate champion for the upcycled food movement, as well as regenerative and circular food systems. Dan's also a co-founding board officer of the nonprofit organizations Upcycled Food Association and the Upcycled Food Foundation. Dan holds a BA from UCLA, where underage home brewing started it all, and a sustainable MBA from Presidio Graduate School. Dan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So first, Nellie, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about your background and what were some of the things you were up to before you got into the work you're doing today?
Well, it's a long story that I'll spare your listeners. Suffice to say, I did have an extended pre-chapter in oceanography. And I think that the sort of connecting thread between the two is that I discovered that I really love working in complex systems with multiple stakeholders and trying to find solutions that actually can make everybody happy, or at least partway happy. And so, long story short, I wound up at Patagonia after the oceanography chapter closed and worked my way into a position in what we call the quote unquote Enviro team, and started project managing a little program called the Common Threads Recycling Initiative that over the next 10 years brought it into its current state of Worn Wear, which is a holistic multi-channel circularity program that includes repair services for Patagonia clothing, trade-in for clothing that's no longer of use, resale, and a bunch of also user-generated content, films. And it kind of set the standard for what circularity could look like in a textile apparel brand. Yeah.
Love it. And so for Worn Wear, so Common Threads was just like, if you had a return, you would send it back and then they would like fix it or something? Or what was Common Threads originally?
Yeah, the Common Threads partnership, the partnership laid out sort of gave like the blueprint of where the brand ended up taking it. But initially, back in 2005, Patagonia said, okay, for items that are totally worn out, we should be recycling those. And said, when you're done with it, bring it back. There was an environmental analysis conducted to understand that we should collect everything, wait till it filled a shipping container, then we could put it on a ship to go to Japan, where it was recycled through phytation, combining with some bottle feedstock and such. So a combination of textile to textile recycling, but also additional PET feedstock. And so this is a polyester recycling program because Patagonia is an outdoor company. Polyester is one of the primary materials used across the line. So it really made sense to go for the biggest material use, largest impact available. But it took a really long time to collect that much stuff. And so kind of the aha moment we had was like, wait, recycling, I think you have a question on this actually, about waste hierarchy. Recycling is actually what we should be doing last. So we learned that in a very visceral, tangible way of oh, this isn't the path we should be pursuing. We should actually be helping to keep Patagonia clothing that's built for durability in play as long as possible through repair services, And then responsible reuse options like reselling it to somebody else who wants it. If it doesn't fit, you don't use it or you don't like it anymore, kind of thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
More to go into, I think, on Warnwear. And for Dan, maybe for you, can you tell us about your background and how you first got into this work you're doing today?
Absolutely. And it's kind of a fun pairing, just like we all hopefully are in a position where we're wearing, textiles every day. My side of the work is on food, right? And that's something that we all make choices around every single day. So I identify as an entrepreneur, and I got my start, as my introduction noted, actually as an underage home brewer when I was a college student, where I started asking some questions about what to do with the really high quality barley that I was using to produce 5-gallon batches of craft beer. After it had been used to brew beer, to make the beer, the sugars had been taken from it. What's left is actually a lot of nutritional value, fiber and protein. It was literally referred to as spent grain by the brewing books and by the industry, as if it has no value left to give. And then with my background interest as a Northern California kind of granola guy with a physician as a father and a dietitian as a mother, and really just understanding the value of fiber and plant protein, and really started asking some questions that I felt like I wasn't supposed to be asking around what to do with this material, because the brewing books say feed it to animals. I was in an urban environment. I didn't have animals to feed it to, or compost is something I grew up with, but didn't have access to compost. My undergraduate, I felt like I was making a big batch of oatmeal. And so no one was really talking about food waste. This was 2009, 2010 when I first started experiencing this, but it felt like I was wasting food every time I was brewing beer. And that led to a discovery that, there's actually a rich history of human consumption of turning this stuff back into things like bread. I figured if I can make beer, I can make bread. Started selling bread to friends. And that kind of humble beginning was what led to what is now a company where we are identifying overlooked, undervalued sources of nutrition, flavor, and functionality in the food system. So things like brewer's grain, which we've now developed into an ingredient that we sell to companies like bakeries, and we can get more into that ingredient specifically if it's relevant. But it's opened my eyes to this whole world of what's being left off the table, whether it's chocolate production or coffee production or milk or any of these food products that we find in the groceries, where most of the time there is potential for kind of a delicious second life to be given to that. So my background and way into circularity is very much inspired by a lot of what was actually started in areas like textiles, and even the term upcycling I first saw used commercially with textiles. And Patagonia, I believe, was among the first companies to use things like water bottles to turn them back into things like fleece. That is upcycling as opposed to recycling. And taken those principles and tried to apply them to the food system, all in this effort to move from this kind of the linear model, right, of take, make, waste, towards a circular one where ends are reimagined as beginnings. And if for anyone, this is an audience that is pretty primed on sustainability topics, so this is also very central to biomimicry, right? And what would nature do? In nature, there is no waste. Principles of permaculture. I mean, this is all parallel thinking around the same idea of how do we do more with less, or some people like to say do more with more. And so I've approached that through an entrepreneur's perspective.
I love this. I'm already excited about this podcast, and we just barely done the intros. So, one thing, for the listeners, I'll frame up sort of why we're having this conversation, and then we'll sort of get into the nuts and bolts. So, as many of you know, the new B Corp standards, which are coming in 2026, have a section on circularity. It's a new section called Environmental Stewardship and Circularity, or ESC for short. So this ESC topic covers more than just circularity. It covers energy, water, waste, biodiversity, supply chain, and a few others. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to focus on circularity for a few reasons. So 3 reasons. 1, it's really fascinating. As you just heard, I'm already excited to talk with Dan and Nellie about each of these things. 2, circularity does have an effect and is, intersects with energy, water, waste, biodiversity, and supply chain. So it touches all of those anyway. And 3, this is likely the first time that many B Corps will be explicitly required to consider circularity. And so we wanted to bring this episode to help folks prepare for the new standards. There's some exceptions for which types of companies will be subject to circularity in the new standards. For example, small companies, less than 10 employees. And, for example, service companies with a minor environmental footprint are not currently subject to the circularity requirements. However, this may change in the future. And regardless of your company's size or industry, the principles of circularity are very useful to know for anyone in the B Corp community and there's undoubtedly reasons to integrate these principles deeper into your business. So the reason I wanted to have Nellie and Dan on the show is because they're both circularity experts in different fields. So Nellie's primarily in textiles, as you heard, and Dan's primarily in regenerative food systems. And we're going to try to make the conversation relevant to folks in a broad swath of industries. And I'll even try to bring in some smaller service-based companies, how they could even consider circularity. So maybe, Dan, I'll go back to you. In your own words, how would you define circularity?
Yeah, not going to be a very technical definition for me because I think that the principle is best expressed, simply, which is that it is reimagining an end as a beginning. This is about literally like doing more with more. And so, you can get down into the specifics of what that looks like in terms of end of life for a product, and avoiding things that are single use, of course, is a core, tenet of something like, like circularity. But it's thinking about, of all the resources collectively that are put into producing something, making sure that those are used to, the optimum, value, just like nature would. So I'll leave it with that more kind of poetic, maybe, or philosophical angle. And Nellie, not to put it all on you, but I know you've got a lot of technical expertise, and maybe you can take this whatever direction you want. Yeah.
I don't know about technical, but I would say the way I sort of try to help people understand circularity as simply as possible, especially in a durable goods sort of space, is keeping things in use as long as possible in their highest value. And that, in circularity at its core, requires both products and systems to work together to unlock. In my opinion, you can't design a product, quote unquote, for circularity if you don't have a system that's ready to accept that product into it and do whatever transformation or service to that to keep it in its highest use as long as possible. There's a term kind of gets technical, slowing the flow, but really what that means is not being in such a fast-paced linear economy where we buy, use, toss, and just repeat. Rather, we invest in quality things, use them as long as possible, and then responsibly dispose of them or pass them along when we're done.
Entropy to some degree is inevitable, right? But I think that's really well put. I mean, maybe it would help also if we talked a little bit about is recycling circularity? What's the difference for that for people who maybe are thinking of circularity as just being
what do you got
for
for
recycling?
That one, Dan? How would you answer it?
I was hoping for Nellie to take that one. It really comes down to the higher use aspect, the highest use possible that Nellie, I think, very eloquently describes. With recycling, and there's, merits and also challenges, with recycling of different materials where you're taking, that shipping container, for example, and then turning it back into the base material to then turn back into more things made from that base material. That would be more of a recycling model, whereas the example of what's gone on with Warrenware is a much better example of circular, where it's kept in that higher use principle. So if I were to take that to food, and food recycling would be more akin to arguably compost, where you're taking a mix of materials and bringing them back to something that could be add nutrients back to the soil, as a soil amendment. That's better than landfill, where something like food breaks down into methane, right? That would be, more of a conventional use compared to a recycling use. Whereas a more circular use would be to make sure that every aspect of the food is used to feed people before anything else lower than that, is explored. Mm-hmm. So if the sugars from the grain are used to make beer, that the fiber and the protein can go on to make, fortified breads, for example, that would be something that the brewery can implement as a circularity measure, but it's also importantly something that a food producer, like a bakery, can implement as, by sourcing a material like that. They're we need, I think Nellie put this really well. It's all interconnected with products and services and different companies that are involved, because the company that generates the opportunity for circularity isn't necessarily going to be the company that actually has the best use case to keep it in its highest use possible.
Yeah.
Great. Nellie, you had mentioned the waste hierarchy earlier. Could you explain that just for folks so we have that sort of baseline?
Yeah. So I think at a sort of simplified approach, the waste hierarchy starts with don't make waste. So prevent making waste so you have less to deal with. Then think about recycling, reuse, and eventually the last step being disposal if you've run out, if exhausted all other options. So circularity kind of stays in that thicker part of the pyramid of the reduction in the first place, what we've been talking about already, keeping things going in their highest value use as long as possible. But then how many times literally can you circle things through? Can you fix something? Can it be shifted? If there's some modularity part about that product that makes it usable in a different form, can it be broken down or repurposed into something else too? But on the recycling thing too, I wanted to share one thing, or maybe like do a little myth bust too,
Yeah.
because I think recycling, like many topics in sustainability, and it sounds like your listeners have a pretty high sustainability acumen here, so it won't be lost on them. But I've seen a trend in recent years of companies wanting to tout, recycled content of products, which sounds great, but then also wanting to kind of hop on the circularity bus. And so just from an educational standpoint, a lot of times when you see recycled content in textiles in particular, I wish companies were forced to disclose one more step further when we say recycled content, because most of the time, I would say probably the majority, the recycled content is post-industrial waste. So it's waste that's coming from the manufacturing process that's swept up, or scraps that are reincorporated into the production process, which is absolutely a fabulous thing, but it's really an efficiency marker. It's like kind of how you should do business if you want to make more money and have better margins and things like that. It is a far, far cry from collecting products from people when they're done with them in whatever shape they may be in, and figuring out how to actually tear those pieces apart and separate components and divert each component into the proper recycling stream. And yet we call both of these recycling, and they're just vastly different in effort, scope, impact. So I just think that's kind of a food for thought, interesting thing to know about recycling.
Thank you. Yeah. Dan, from your end, maybe we could wrap on the recycling piece by talking a little bit about, plastic waste, especially in the food industry. I know it's huge. Yeah. And this realization, I would say I'm pretty sustainably literate, but it was only maybe a couple of years ago when I realized how low plastic was actually recycled. It's like less than 10% or something.
Single digits. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what does that mean for any company that's out there, like food or otherwise, that's making products with plastic? Is it just we have to get away from plastic as quick as possible? Or what is your latest thinking on that?
Yeah. From circularity, it's about better plastics using different materials, especially plastics have a lot of issues. One of them is that they come from fossil fuels, period. Another is that plastics, as they're often used, are used in combination with other materials and different layers, which make them, even if there were secondary markets for recycling, nearly practically impossible to actually separate those layers into their component parts and get them into recycling streams. So they just end up in a landfill environment. And, the reality is that most food companies, most consumer packaged goods companies, the P and the packaging, we're in the future trash business a lot of the time. And it's a real challenge. And there's, many leaders that I know personally, and others that what I see companies doing just in the space are earnestly, wanting to do more of this. But the status quo is single-use plastics are the cheapest and actually, have a lot of functional properties that are perceived to be in terms of shelf life and things like that make it the baseline. Now, what's it look like, to move past that, becomes a more challenging question. We could go into compostable, plastics, but
you've experimented with compostable packaging, right? For your products.
Sure have. Yeah. But I'm actually more excited today about the potential of things like new types of materials. There's a way to make PHA, which is a type of plastic. It's a rigid plastic that's actually made from organic food waste, organic, waste materials. So, once as an alternative, like compost, for example, you can turn this stuff back into a bioplastic that actually, can be ocean degradable, for example. That's more of how can we use the principles of circularity to solve for, the plastic, packaging issue. But there's also other, do a little myth busting too. There's other technologies, call them, that are talked about in the space, there's a relatively recent one around landfill degradable plastics or oxo-degradable plastics or something like that, where the claim is basically that they've inserted something into this called a matrix, of the plastic that will, in a landfill environment, have it break down at a faster rate. And, there's a lot of challenges I have with that. One of them is that it gives well-meaning operators of companies something that seems like a, kind of a magic bullet type solution for the plastics problem, when they'd actually be better served by looking at it, other, maybe harder, but more effective, more circular driven, ideas. And, to kind of wrap up, just circling back to some of Nellie's comments on the last question about the waste hierarchy, there's actually a really strong business case to be made a lot of times for staying higher in that hierarchy. A lot of times there's not upfront investment and challenges and things like that and getting from 0 to 1. But particularly when you look across the long term, in some cases, in the near term, there's actually profit maximizing potential by staying higher in that hierarchy as well. And so it's not always the case where the right thing, is the easy thing. But when it comes to waste reduction and incorporating principles of circularity, it's often also there's like some common sense business principles that they go into that as well.
Well, maybe, I'm thinking if I'm a listener, maybe I'm a B Corp and I'd love to maybe try this with both of you. So for Nellie, maybe it's like, hey, I'm a company that's a B Corp that has a textile, like maybe I do clothing or, there's something in the textile space and I don't really do circularity now, but I'm interested in doing it. And so like, what do you talked about, like companies who come to you in that initial stage of like, I know I should be doing this, but I don't really do it now. And like, how do you help them sort of think through like how to integrate circularity into their business or products?
Yeah, we're really fortunate in the apparel space in particular, and increasingly in home, that there's a wide variety of startups and of service providers to help facilitate circularity and specifically circular business models. So I'm thinking about resale or e-commerce. We've heard those words. Rental, circular subscription, to be clear, the stuff has to come back, circular. So the way I start to talk about it with a client is say, okay, today, like if you look at your total revenue of your company, it's probably all coming from linear sources. Like that revenue pie is like 100% linear today. And hopefully your leadership wants to start to be thinking towards how can you create a slice of that pie that is from circular sources? And the way I would define that is through alternative business models, like service-based business models. Can you remediate, repair, refurbish a product for a customer to increase its lifetime, to enhance its performance? Like, how can you create value for your customers through a service-based model and also through a resale or rental, like an alternative way of purchasing products, whether that's purchasing a used product or accessing a product through a rental type program? And then also, how can you design products that actually do fit a circularity definition? Can they be made of recycled materials and be recyclable? As I think Dan really clearly articulated, like around the packaging thing, that problem of like things that are all glued and stuck together and mishmash, you can't pull them apart, so it's really hard to recycle them. That's characteristic of like pretty much everything in our house. It's to have a monomaterial type product. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, about having a system to accept that. So I actually think that starting with different purchasing models can be an easier lift than product design. It allows a company to take responsibility for hopefully a large percentage of product that they've already put out into the world. So you get this kind of like moment to correct past mistakes, if you will. But it also depends on the product and the company. So the starting point means like, okay, when you design a product, what's the use case for it? Is this a product that is going to be a daily driver, needs to be durable? It's like a basic, people are going to use it on a very, very regular cadence. Well, then that might shift us into a design for durability track, perhaps versus something that is going to have naturally a shorter lifespan and therefore maybe should be designed for recyclability. So you need to like pick this design path from the get-go. And you can do that retrospectively too. You can think about the types of products you put out there. So like from the apparel standpoint, are we designing a highly waterproof, breathable rain jacket, or we design a pair of underwear or socks? Like those have very different implications and how long they'll be used and for what uses. So while that does sound like a design question, that's also kind of the first question you design a business model. Like, how does somebody want to access this product? If it is the socks and underwear thing, then yeah, maybe some sort of take back bag where you reclaim those products and ideally could do some sort of textile type recycling, or partner with other brands that can have a similar material to consolidate and create like a real stream of materials that can be reused, versus a higher end product that maybe that's an aspirational product for a lot of people. There's people who would like to own it, but it's out of their reach. It's not economically feasible for many people to own it. So that might make more sense to try to entice your customers to sell those back to you and resell them secondhand, or to offer an access point. Other products that have really short lifespans, like the classic circularity example is that we all own a drill, like an electric drill, and it's used for 15 minutes. Like that was like one of the original, like 2015, what is circularity? Like we don't all need to own a drill. We should just have like a neighborhood drill to use. But that's like a classic example. You look at Home Depot is the largest rental. I think they have the largest rental program in the United States. They rent over almost 500,000 tools a year. We don't all need tools, tool sitting. I can look at my garage right now and know there's, stuff in there that could be loaned out. So thinking about the customer, thinking about the use case for the product, and then building circular solutions that create additional value on top of just your regular linear system to try to grow that pie, to diversify your revenue streams and displace some proportion of the revenue that you make just from making stuff and selling it.
That's great. That was a mic drop moment. I was like, do we even need anything else on this? It's like, I just want to say thank you for how do we take, because I was honestly coming into this thinking like, how do you redesign your products? But what you just opened me up to was like, well, maybe it's on the services side and it's not just starting from scratch, redesigning everything. So that was super helpful.
Yeah, you can do them concurrently, which is cool too, because it is the system product unlock. And so maybe you start with building the system and then it actually starts to change how you build your product. I've seen that many, many times with customers, even Patagonia, as you start to have a place where your customers want to play, it affects how you think about your products. Like if you're going to offer repair, it all of a sudden makes you design your products to be easy to repair because it costs less, reduces turn time, and just makes the entire process more efficient, simple, and potentially profitable if you're charging for it. So yeah, it has this wonderful positive flywheel effect that can happen on the design side and the system side.
Yeah, and as we're thinking about it as like an ecosystem too, I think it's really important that leaders, no matter what the sector, and maybe particularly for smaller, medium-sized companies, but certainly larger ones, to be open to partnerships, as well, because you don't need to be the expert, in this necessarily in order to incorporate the practice. And there's a wealth of startups across sectors, and some more established companies too, where their whole business model is this, what's called waste to value or waste valorization technology. And, in a lot of cases, this is one where the right thing isn't necessarily the easy thing because, the status quo is sort of working, in that people buy new products, and we're not going to fix this on this call for sure, but we're obviously not accounting for the full cost of producing that product in the first place because, virgin materials as opposed to circular materials tend to be actually cheaper, in a lot of cases today. Some of that's changing and we can get into some of that too. But, where you can find, and open yourself up to partnerships, work with someone to actually uncover, maybe you're sitting on a gold mine and you don't know it, but it's just outside of your industry. And there's some various examples of that, historically that I think are worth mentioning that weren't called circularity at the time, that were just good business. Like if you look at the restaurant industry and cooking oil, and which used to be a cost center and a risk for these operations to manage. Now they have to lock it up because it's contracted for, biofuel sources.
I remember a lot of my friends had 1980s Mercedes Benzes powered by free cooking oil at UC Santa Cruz.
I love it, and that actually flipped that, that economic equation on its head. In food processing, there's also whey protein, which comes from cheese making. I'm not sure if this is apocryphal or fact. I've been told by people who know about this that there's cheese companies where actually the whey is their main product and the cheese is the secondary product. That's kind of interesting, but this used to be a material that in many cases, in some cases still does, enter waterways and create waste problems. Even in in a non-sustainable industry, at least conventionally, paper processing, chemicals as a co-product of that ended up becoming a secondary and very lucrative market for these processors. So we've figured this out before in little bits and pieces, and I think what a lot of us are interested in is how to make that the default for the whole system. Not every aspect of what I just said. Right?
It's so cool. No, Dan, I think it's such a good point you bring up, especially within the B Corp community, because if there's any place where you can get some cross collaboration synergies, it's there's sort of a litmus test, okay, you're a B Corp, so you're already thinking this way. Because it feels to me like the largest stumbling block there is how do you know what, you said, you're sitting on this pile of gold, how do I know I'm sitting on it? Who else wants it? And what are the forums that are out there that help people connect those dots?
Yeah, we need an alchemist.
Yes, matchmaking alchemist.
That's why our company exists. And there's, a lot of examples. Some that are making, there's that Burrito company, the Patagonia I know was involved with for some time. And I'm not totally sure how they're doing today, but always really loved their model of taking fishing nets and turning them into plastic material to turn back into, initially it was skateboards, but then it became, more than that. And
now
there's
it's
so much
trucker hats and yoga leggings and all sorts of great things. Yeah, those guys are cranking away. That's a good example. Yeah.
Dan, I'm wondering if sort of similar question to what I asked Nellie, say I'm a B Corp in the food space and I'm I kind of do maybe I buy organic sometimes of products to make my food or whatever, but I'm not really like in thinking in a circularity lens. Like, what do you say to somebody who's maybe starting from that very early stage and doesn't really know how to get into it? Like, how would you recommend they think about circularity with food?
Yeah, I mean, for this audience, one of the framework maybe to be thinking about that I often think about is like scope one circularity and like scope, three, I guess, arguably circularity. Scope one being, kind of that internal audit, what's it look like to, and you could do that yourself or bring in someone else, to do it for sure. But, what's the status quo, in terms of the internal operation within the walls of your production, if you're a products company, right? And then scope three, as I think about it, is, redesigning. This is more where you thought I think a lot of this conversation was going to go, Ryan, is like for new product development or reformulating existing products, where can there be, I'm just going to use the word ingredients, inputs, that are sourced from other industries' outputs, right? And how can that sourcing, of a raw material be sourced from a circular source as opposed to a virgin source? And so kind of like, those are like the two main areas that I would typically explore first and concurrently, honestly.
Yeah. So for regrained, like you had these spent grains in your bathtub or whatever, and how did you start to like make those connections or like think about a business model that really included some of those quote unquote end of life things that maybe weren't quite end of life?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one insight to share from that is the first version of the idea was to be a brewery that was also a food company and have like a fully circular operation internally. Still love to do that someday. I think it sounds fun. But the insight that we uncovered, and this is as students, just kind of interviewing people like brewery owners and reading entrepreneurship books and, all the kind of scrappy things you do when you're young and trying to figure it out. We learned that so many of these breweries were, especially with the boom in craft beer that was happening at the time, 2010-ish, that there's about 2 new breweries opening per day. Today, by the way, there's more than 9,000 breweries in operation in the US. A lot of these were opening up in urban areas, and a lot of these breweries, whether they're in an urban area or not, were having to do something, with their grain. And so we had this aha of, oh, maybe the opportunity is actually to figure out how we can be a value-added partner to the brewery and then to food companies, as an ingredient supplier and be in the middle of making that happen. Because, we had this additional insight, and importantly, that breweries, they're in the beer making business. They're not in the food making business. So the best use for the grain after it's been used to brew, is to create, nutritionally dense, food products. But a beer company is in the business of producing beer. And so there's kind of this disconnect between, where that application is and where the source of that material was. And then you have all these food companies that want to create products that are better for people and planet, but they're not in the ingredient business. And so it just felt like there was this, like, what I'd characterize as a missing market, as a market failure, where there's like latent supply, latent demand. And we felt like we could try to craft a model, that could solve both, and create shared value.
Great. Yeah. And, Nellie, earlier you were speaking about sort of product disassembly and modular. Could you speak about, I guess I'm imagining if I'm, say, a B Corp and maybe I do have a product, maybe it's a textile or something, and I'm thinking, oh God, like, how do I do like a jeans? Like, people are going to start sending me back their jeans all of a sudden, and I have to like set up all these systems. So like, how do you counter, like, how do you think about what is the financial implications of doing circular models? Like, maybe that's one reason people are like wary a little bit of like, oh, is this going to be a lot of upfront cost? And then like, maybe how do you think about the mechanics of a company that maybe doesn't have any of that like service component built in to their product company?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I almost wanted to ask, and well, maybe I will pass over to Dan. It's like, I think one of the hardest things about circularity is selling it. Because, I mean, this is probably a bit of an insular group in the audience. I say that too, but like eventually we have to get these ideas up the ladder at an organization and get sign off. And so to more directly answer your question here is like kind of what's in it for the business, and the jeans example, like, okay, well, who is the consumer of these jeans? And why would they want them remade or, cut up and made into something else? And so this is a time, I mean, the world, as we all know, is changing so quickly. Consumption patterns are changing. Every generation brings its own preferences and flair to their own consumption habits. And watching the space deeply over the last 15 years is, I think every year we're increasingly getting more and more comfortable with consuming things through circularity. And so if a business wants to be relevant and it wants to acquire customers and keep customers, it has to evolve too. I mean, the theory of evolution, like we have to evolve to the environment in order to survive. And so that's sort of like business case number one I would make. And in order to do that profitably, like Dan, you were saying, like the partnership thing is out there. And it's so cool to hear about other industries that also have startups or funding that's coming through. You don't have to build it yourself. There are definitely great resources out there. So like the denim example, there's an incredible, I wouldn't even necessarily call them a startup, but an independent sewing shop in Los Angeles that's vertically integrated. It's called Sway Sew Shop. They have various corporate partnerships and also their own remaking business where they do exactly that. They take trash and they remake it into new clothes. Trash meaning like textiles. And so I think there's people out there that you can learn and pilot with and figure out how to play in this game and see what resonates and test and sort of like through testing, de-risk the opportunity so that leadership becomes increasingly comfortable. And, you know, one example we had at Patagonia is when we originally launched the resale component of Warmwear, we were like pretty limited in the categories of products that we included in the program. We were like pretty much focused on like higher end alpine, so like rain shells, ski jackets, things like that, insulation pieces, like probably pieces that started at like, you know, $150 to $200 minimum, like a very high end. Fast forward maybe 2 or 3 years later, max, and we had started adding different items in and sometimes curating those selections depending where we're going. Again, like kind of conducting these smaller experiments. And I remember we were going to a kiteboarding event in the Columbia River Gorge or something like that. Can we resell board shorts? Like, is that gross? Are we going to do this? We're like, well, let's try it. And we sent up a rack of board shorts and they sold out. And I was like, okay, Circularity is here. When we're buying used swimwear, like we have reached a new level of comfort. Like this is here to stay. So I think like cultural and consumer relevancy for businesses is like that needs to get sold in. Figuring out how to de-risk it and make it an authentic experience for the brand. That's why Warmwear is so powerful. And I would also say like Doen's program is extremely powerful too. They are physical manifestations of what the brand stands for. And people are attracted to that. They can feel the realness of these programs. Circularity creates an incredible brand moment. And then the profitability, like going back to the pie thing, like I believe that when it comes to like circular business models, they need to be profitable. Like that's the rules of engagement in this game of capitalism. So in my opinion, they need to quickly figure out how to pay for themselves and generate some revenue.
100%. One thing that I just want to pull out from that most excellent answer is the kernel around basically, piloting these programs too. And like de-risking going from 0 to 1 is one of the most important things that can happen here, because it's too easy, I think, for people to get caught up in coming up with the perfect, what they think is the perfect plan, or trying to get to the perfect plan and finding, there's all these like interconnected things that you know some of the things you don't know some of the things you don't know. And like the only way to really figure it out is to start doing something. Yeah. You don't have to do everything all at once. And like, for example, Nellie, with the Patagonia program, I don't know if this can be disclosed or not, but I'm curious if that was initially done using like in-house logistics resources, or if a company like they used to be called Yurtle, I think they have a different name now, but, is there like a partner that was brought on to also like de-risk that and take, something that maybe would have been a large fixed cost and make it a variable cost and, make it something that can be,
Yep. Yeah, we partnered. Yeah, it was Yurtle when we started working them in Now Trove, and they built the Warmwear website, and we did some of the collection in-house and sortation, and then we were really collaborative. And we also viewed it always as like a shifting supply chain that we were building and who would own sort of what. And that changes, company to company. And just to like do a little, like with Doen's program, a little highlight on them, like they really viewed the program as a relatively new apparel brand, 5-7 years old, something like that. They're like, okay, our goal is like grow this program as we grow our brand. We want to grow our brand. We're not necessarily going to change the mission of our business, but we see circularity as a very important commitment that we need to make to be a responsible apparel company. And so they process the stuff they collect in-house. They clean it in-house. They have a technology partner that facilitates the take back, but they actually build the whole website, and they are one of the only brands that have a combined shopping cart now. So you can buy like new and used together. So it's a seamless customer experience, and the program's done exceedingly well. So it's like, you kind of have to figure out what's going to work in each system and build that. I love the term ecosystem, because it's like ecosystem dynamics and where are the synergies? Like what's going to happen and what needs to be triaged too and can't happen in-house, maybe today or needs to be outsourced.
Yeah, there's selling internally and there's also selling externally too. I think is an important part of these programs, especially if it's one where there's not a kind of scope one, creative reuse type opportunity for takebacks and resale. And one of the biggest learnings I've had, around that is to not overlook early conversations on the demand side of the market. Whether it's, there's a company that I recently learned about that has a collection program with chopsticks, from restaurants. And they turn them as an input material into like, a composite type wood, which then becomes tables that they then sell to restaurants, right? And it's cool. The idea of what to turn chopsticks. And if you start with that, I don't know, you might have come up with 10 different things for what they could be used for. But knowing, okay, well, if these restaurants need to buy new tables anyways, I don't know if that's exactly how it went for them. But just as an example of like engaging, like where this is going to go, what problem is this going to solve for another, for a customer? And there's a lot of supply chain risk that companies have right now, disruptions happening, not just in food, every industry, whether it's, related to port strikes or geopolitical conflict, or importantly, the climate crisis, right? Especially for food and, raw materials and the regions that they're grown, or ethical issues that are risk also with like labor practices that go into producing those products. Yeah. And circularity offers a really compelling solution where if we can find materials where they already are and use them, to meet these demand states as better alternatives to what's conventional. If you start with that, the rest of nothing's easy, in any of this. But if you start with knowing what that risk, and opposed to like coming up with a solution and trying to create a market for that solution, and I think that is where a partnership, can help a company uncover that. But I just wanted to bring that, to the foreground of this discussion as well.
Yeah. And I know Patagonia, I think, is like the largest repairer of clothing in the US, right? It's like,
outside the US military.
Oh, wow.
So it's this tiered system that we developed. It's really interesting because it was, again, solving a solution to a pain point, is that once we started talking about repair, our customers wanted to utilize the service, and the system became totally overburdened and people were waiting a really long time to get their things back. And so then we were, just replacing things, but then we're replacing things that could be repaired, and like the cognitive dissonance and like, oh my God, we're not doing it right. Like, how are we going to deal with this? And so we worked with a company in San Luis Obispo called iFixit to develop a very holistic approach to teaching how to do repairs to our retail employees. And they became the triage station. So a major repair of Patagonia is zippers. But the thing about zippers is like, they don't always need to be replaced. Like sometimes it's just a slider component, and that takes 3 minutes to replace compared to sending something to a repair center in Reno and the emissions accrued for transportation. It's like, oh, whoa, if we can train people how to properly diagnose even just this one specific repair, it's like a huge expense reduction and everything. So yeah, our stores became our triage centers. And then we contracted with actual local repair shops that were vetted by our quality teams. And we have like Patagonia parts on hand. Like we know that they are able to complete a repair to Patagonia standards. And then could also still utilize our own in-house repair services for some of the like gnarlier, like tougher stuff to fix, or what I would call like historical reenactments, people who want the thing to look exactly like it did versus like a more like wabi-sabi celebration of repair kind of thing. So, and that was just outside of all the tours that we were doing too, where we were just going and meeting people and getting whatever landed in our laps that day would be what would be repaired. So yeah, it's a really extensive ecosystem.
And is Patagonia's worn wear, like, is that actually a profitable part of the business, or is that?
It is, yeah.
What's the
component? Yeah.
Maybe the two of you would love to answer. Like, what is the sort of the shadow underbelly of circularity, where it's like the promise doesn't actually get delivered? So I don't know if that does that show up for you at all, Nellie?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a few years since I've been at Patagonia, but when I was there, it was profitable, and that they've made a conscientious decision about not to charge for repairs. And, I think that makes sense when you're trying to re-educate a consumer. And, we said at Patagonia, we're trying to change people from being consumers to owners, and the difference, like being that owners are actually willing to repair their things, invest in quality pieces, etc. So, it'd be fun. We always have some sort of like restocking fee for people who opt out of repair. Is there like a punitive charge if you don't pick the right environmental choice? But, pie in the sky kind of thing. But, Doen's going to be publishing some numbers probably quite soon, and their program was very financially successful in its first year. But this is where the question of partnerships can take a little bit of a left turn. And these are, when you're transacting in the circular system, whether it's resale or rental, you're charging less for the same product than you are new. So you're playing with smaller margins, and the more hands that are in the pot, the less everybody makes. So it's like the partnership thing, I think, is we were talking earlier, it's like so important and so key for that de-risking, learning, figuring out. But this is now the point where different industries are at different levels of maturity and circularity. And in particular, my field within apparel, it's kind of time to start bringing some of this in-house if people want it to be economically viable long-term. Like, and that doesn't necessarily mean the whole thing, but like what part should brands be owning of this to increase the profitability of these programs so that they take up that bigger slice of the pie so we don't have to make as much new stuff?
Maybe Dan, for you, I remember this is many years ago, but I know you had experimented with compostable packaging at Regrain, and you're like, the shelf life, there's like a constant battle with like compostable packaging and then like whether it actually works. And is there any sort of like, failures or secret underbelly of circularity that it's helpful for people to know about?
Yeah, I'll get to that. And, one other thing I wanted to bring into this, I get really on Nellie's most excellent answer. I'm really enjoying this conversation. One is just, I don't know what to do about this, but this is like part of the dark, side of circularity that is it feels like an intractable challenge is what I mentioned earlier around virgin materials being oftentimes cheaper, than other materials. And that's for a lot of reasons, including just the way the system is structured, actually keeps the full cost, from being born, at various aspects of that. And that's companies like Patagonia are amazing beacons, paragons of like really, how to put values into practice. And they've enjoyed tremendous commercial success in no small part due to that. But I don't think we can ignore that most businesses, most of the time, when something is cheaper and works, they're not going to make that change. And it's a really overwhelming aspect of this problem, even for someone like me, where I dedicated my entire professional career so far to trying to advance solutions to making that right thing, the easy thing. But that is just a real core challenge. And it is connected to this packaging question that you brought back up, Brian. The short version of it was, we had this realization that we were in the future trash business with our packaging, but we had this business model. At the time we were doing consumer products, we're a business to business company. We were selling ingredients, and we were also selling finished goods as a way to like demonstrate market acceptance and educate, the industry and people about what we're doing. And our first product was a nutrition bar. And we realized that in packaging these nutrition bars, we cannot be creating packaging waste while we were trying to solve for food waste. And so the very first bars we ever did, we got this like really janky, old, like crinkly, biodegradable packaging. And, we grew from that as the baseline. Like we called it a non-negotiable value for the company, which was definitely language inspired by Patagonia. And as we grew in distribution and things like that, we definitely evolved that packaging a bit. But as our distribution grew, we also learned things like that our product was actually going stale in distribution when it was subjected to like hotter trucks, for example. So like our control sample in the warehouse would be fine. And then we'd get reports from the store that the product was, like hard as a rock or something. And so the kind of like double irony there is then our packaging, our decisions to try to reduce, not create packaging waste while we were selling for food waste ended up creating food waste, actually. And it was just such a nightmare. And it actually was one of the key catalysts for us just getting out of, this hybrid business model of making consumer products. We are not a packaging company. We invested heavily in this, especially relatively, to our really very much early stage bootstrapped company. And it was a painful lesson, and we were very public and transparent about it. And there have been developments in compostable packaging. And that's probably a whole podcast about compostable packaging, but that's more or less what happened, with us. And it was a real test of our values, and it helped inform a strategic evolution of the business model to move away from doing these consumer products because we weren't confident that we were the right people to solve that aspect, of it.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to the OSC2 One Step Closer to Organic Sustainable Solution. I think that maybe is their packaging collective of consumer packaged good companies who are probably still trying to solve the compostable packaging problem.
We became a case. We became a case study of what not to do for that group, and, more broadly. Yeah, OSC2 is doing some great work, and there is a lot of advancements around better materials coming in. So it's like, okay, how can we remove, petroleum, derived materials from, the inputs, of this, whether or not it's Then there's the downstream question of what happens after, a consumer uses a product, it finishes a wrapper. Are they going to be able to compost it at home? For a long time, even still to some extent, there's a lot of focus on that. As there should be, like downstream, what happens to this? But, as it relates to practical circularity today, upstream, there are viable solutions that are plant-based, and maybe they're not home compostable necessarily, but they're not petroleum-based. So there can still be like a net benefit from that with product level performance. It's not going to compromise the safety or quality of the product and create a whole other inadvertent set of problems on that. Yeah. So yeah, it's a tough one.
One thing that was such an interesting story, Dan, I love that. But just to rewind for a second, we were talking about the underbelly and like making the right choices and stuff. I think where we might have this like wonderful synergy between increased environmental regulations and environmental disclosures and circularity, and hopefully helps people like quote unquote make the right choice, or the choice that many of us hope that companies will make, is that the reduction in footprint, carbon footprints, and other impact indicators too can be quite dramatic with circularity. I mean, not to harp on the business models, but I mean, the numbers that I've crunched for various clients, you're looking at a 90% reduction in footprint when you buy an item used versus buying it new. That's huge. So that means you've effectively almost entirely decoupled impact creation from revenue generation. And that is the gold standard of circularity right there. Like, how do you make, we're saying do more with more, make more with less? Like, yeah, making money with less impact is the name of the game now. I mean, that sounds quite commercial and maybe kind of gross coming out of my mouth, but I mean, that's again the system we play in.
But related to that, so how do we get around the fact that, so we all shop online, I'm sure, and, receive things, whether, apparel or, in some cases, things like furniture, and, it arrives damaged, right? Because you decided to have furniture shipped to your house, which, big surprise there, but okay. Right. Then you contact the company and you're like, okay, this is damaged, and they say, actually just keep it. I'll send you another one. Right. I mean, the economic incentives are not currently aligning so that most companies want it. Like, what's it going to take for more companies to say, we will take this back and we'll fix it and we'll read. So not that you're going to expect it to have the answer to that, but it's just, again, on this topic of like, what's hard about this? Yeah.
I don't have the answer, but I do think that reverse logistics is going to be one of the biggest spaces of circularity and sustainability growth in the next 1 to 3 years. I think that there's increasingly like a highlight on this. I've noticed like a lot of tightening up on return policies recently too, like companies getting a little bit more stringent. I think during COVID times, it was like, you want to buy something? Great. Yeah, we don't want it back. It's been in your house. And we got kind of like lax about it all. But now companies are looking at the balance sheets and going, oh, geez, this isn't good. We need to address this. And I think folks who lead reverse logistics at companies are seeing opportunities. They're looking at circularity and going, I got a salvage business that I think might do a lot better under a circularity business. Like, how do I bring some of this in-house rather than, auctioning it off? I mean, the myriad of ways that things are moved off of a company's ledger is bananas. But I think there's a growing trend to be like, well, how could we monetize this and bring this more in-house? And even within the apparel sector, a large proportion of the programs that, these circularity resale programs that you see out there are fed not just from customers trading in their items, but they're from returns as well. So, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, maybe they should be marked so people understand, kind of are we buying an open box product or a used product. But yeah, but that's great. I mean, make some money off of it. See phone up again, like don't make as much new stuff. Like that's what we're after.
Nellie, you had said earlier in the interview, there's like when a company's thinking about circularity, there's like the product packaging, maybe the service offering that could maybe complement some of those. But you also mentioned like the system that's like ready to accept and like support circularity. Could you explain what that means? And
yeah, and I probably wasn't very clear. I kind of use system and business model synonymously. So, is the system like a buyback program, or is the system a rental program? So looking at like the baby space, for example, I just read a report recently that estimated that like for baby gear for kids under 18 months, a family uses about 10% of the life of the gear. So if that baby gear is not shared, passed along, etc., it just goes to landfill. 90% of the value, the lifetime, is landfill. And so, as a baby gear company thinking about like a rental opportunity, where people can just, use the item for those like 6 weeks that it's super critical. That would be the system that would be ready to accept the item in and out, so it's a way to bring an item back, a way to inspect it, clean it, prepare it for the next family. That would be like how I would define the system. And then the product might also need to be redesigned in order to fit the system. So can like, if it's like, like a bouncer or something, can you pull the cloth off and launder that and wipe the metal down and clean the different components appropriately? So that would be like that synergy between system and product, or system/business model.
Yeah, it's like a product as a service.
Yeah. Right. Totally.
Yeah, I'd love to see more of that. It makes me think of the rocking snoo product too.
Right. They have a whole rental.
They have a rental thing. Although also if you buy one secondhand, you don't qualify for the repairs and everything that, that comes with that. And so there's like some things like that I see too, where it's like, actually, they
just got a little bit of hot water with consumers on that one. Yeah. Kind of changing the terms of engagement. Like, gosh, that sort of planned obsolescence or built-in obsolescence.
Dan, maybe for you on the food side, as we're, looking in the last like maybe 10 minutes or so here, what are like the maybe top 2 or 3 things? I know like there's probably more than that, but just like if a company, again, is considering, how do I think about circularity in the food space? Are there like 2 or 3 like really key principles or things they should consider, or like just you might recommend they think about as they're looking at expanding circularity?
Yeah, I think I'll focus my answer on like manufacturers probably for the scope of this, but I think there's aspects of circularity that can be applied, whether it's a retailer or a distributor or a restaurant, or someone else in that food system world. If you look at the numbers around food waste by cause, and Refed is the best source for this that I've ever seen, refed.org. And you can break it down by sector, and actually like processing side streams, byproducts, things like trimmings, that's actually like the largest cause of food waste for food manufacturers. And it's not that surprising when you consider, things like when we go to the store and we buy, a head of broccoli, we don't really think about the fact that floret of broccoli is like less than 30% of the plant itself. I've grown broccoli before and seen this firsthand. I was like, oh my God, this plant is huge. And that applies to almost any, product. So like, you think of a product like baby carrots, those aren't like tiny little carrots that they grow out of the ground. They're trimmed down to that, typically actually from cosmetically imperfect carrots originally. But, when you think about like, the agriculture and what we're growing and like what we've decided is the product, thinking about what else could be co-products in that is a really, important place to start. I think for anyone who's doing food processing, one of the challenges that just requires a bit of a shift in the operating pursuit, and we help companies with this, by the way, through like part of our business model is innovation partnerships to help companies unlock things like food waste, circularity. A lot of times different materials are co-mingled, so kind of similar problem with what we're talking about with like plastics being layered on top of each other and not making it difficult to do anything with any parts of that. Separation of different materials, is a really important first step of like being able to actually have an opportunity to reuse them for something else for a lot of reasons. That's one that, a manufacturer, processor could be thinking about is like when we're making our primary product, like what are the side streams and what happens with those side streams? Are they all just, most often they're just put in a common, receptacle that then gets sent out to animal feed or compost or something like that. So that's like, internally looking at these byproducts, co-products, what they could become co-products. The other aspect of it is around sourcing, of ingredients for new product development or reformulating existing products, using ingredients that are made, from some of these other ways. So instead of, continuing like the status quo of sourcing virgin materials for everything, maybe there's a way to get to your fiber claim, or net carb reduction, by using, something like an upcycled grain from, breweries. There's a lot of examples, like that we could share. But I think, a lot of it starts with just really looking at and rethinking this version of the linear model of like, we're making this one product and expanding that into, what are we leaving off the table? What are potential co-products, from this process?
Yeah. I just want to say the broccoli example really resonated because I started like cooking the leaves that like came off I was like, can you eat these?
Yeah.
Like there's not, like, why don't you sell? I know you can.
They're like kale.
Like, they're really good.
I was like, why don't they sell broccoli leaves in the store? I was like, there's probably so many broccoli leaves.
Yeah. Or the tops of, beets or, all these things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like what you said of like, this is what we've decided the product is. It's such a, the word, but I'm trying to think of the word. It's like this.
Good framing.
It's such a human spin on this of like, this is what's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Nellie, maybe a similar question of like, what are maybe 2 or 3 like sort of takeaways or things you would love people to know on the like textile side, like how they should start thinking about this?
Yeah. So I would encourage like that two brain thinking of like, how are we designing our products and how are we building systems to enable circularity to unlock that revenue stream to diversify the revenue pie from strictly linear to partially circular. I think there are numerous methodologies about how to measure circularity. And I always advise to keep it quite simple. And how much revenue are you deriving from the system? Because the circular economy is the only way I've ever really seen a durable goods type product brand to exist in a more sustainable way, to like not make as much stuff and to make more money off the products you've already created and through servicing them. Like that's the grand vision. And then also make them more responsibly too. But, Dan made a great point. It's like, it costs a lot of money to purchase really sustainable materials. They're in high demand. They're pricey versus building a system that can transact things you've already made and keep transacting them and keep making incremental revenue off of them today. So I would say just like try to keep that big picture in mind. And in doing so, you hopefully will win favoritism with leadership because you're creating an additional value proposition for your consumers. You're creating a profitable revenue stream it's additive to the company, and you're future-proofing your company for a more resource scarce, regulated world that we're increasingly living in.
Yeah. I mean, the word that came to me a little bit is like innovation. Like it's like sort of the constraint. I love this idea of creating less stuff and like making more money off the stuff you've already created. I don't know. It just seems like kind of revolutionary. Like many companies are not thinking that way. And then it just forces you to be innovative. Be like, okay, well, wait a minute. We've already made all this stuff. How do we stop making new stuff and make more? Yeah. So I think it's a whole different set of thought processes.
Yeah, it is sort of like I probably made it sound a little simplistic because it is like a whole like mindset shift of like, hey, we've been figuring out how to make better products cheaper, faster, and like getting this stuff out the door and increasing margins. So it's a very different way of thinking. But I think that if you embrace the challenge of how do we innovate our way out of this using these sort of guidelines of circularity to help us make better choices, you can actually make some really fascinating, like engaging programs that can actually have like quite a large halo effect too. Like there'll be positive repercussions of that work for your company.
Yeah, I think this is an audience that's by definition primed. Anyone listening to this, to use business as a force for good. And I say twist on that I speak about a lot in my day to day is how innovation can be a force for good, right? And that's what we're talking about here. And that word gets tossed around a lot, innovation. And my favorite definition of it in very simple terms is putting creativity into action. Right. So it's, to use innovation as a force for good, you have to put creativity into action, as a force for good. You have to take action. And I think that's, my biggest hope from participating in this conversation is that, some of the listeners are inspired to just start taking some action.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was reading an article, it's a few years old, published in HBR by Doug Holt. It talked about cultural innovation. And I increasingly think that circularity is cultural innovation. So like we can think of innovation as like building a better mousetrap. Like how do we just like improve this product? And these are like performance improvements or cost reductions or something like that. But circularity, it's an idea of selling an idea. We're going to create innovation from a cultural standpoint so that we get people thinking, it's kind of cooler to have an older Patagonia jacket that's repaired. It's kind of cool that like I just use this baby gear as I need it and then it's gone, and the irony is that the auto industry has done this forever. They sell us cars, they lease us cars, they fix us cars, they trade in our cars. Like we are culturally circular when it comes to cars. We share cars, we share rides. Like, isn't that funny?
Yeah.
In the industry, it's like,
yeah,
we think of this,
it's
like
just a small industry,
boy.
Though. It's just the small auto industry. Yeah.
Yeah. So lesson today is look at the auto industry and
well,
take a note out of their playbook.
I also want to throw some of the service companies a bone real quick around like what could they do. So a couple of things I wrote down are things like sustainable procurement. So, obviously buying stuff with recycled or upcycled content, digital circularity. You could look at like digital service providers like cloud or software platforms that use renewable energy or sort of energy efficient and minimize digital infrastructure impact, potentially shared resources like shared office space, technology and equipment, internal reuse and repurposing. So I think there's a lot that, the service side can do as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's maybe in the like provision of goods and services for your company, but that can still have an impact. And so just,
I was just reading last month that Lenovo, the laptop provider, has developed a tool that measures impact. I think it is part of their procurement offerings, the B2B service offering, that will help their clients measure like the footprint of Lenovo laptops, but that you can buy them used, have them refurbished. Like it takes circularity into account in calculating what that footprint will be. And, obviously buying anything used, like I think you can pretty safely say it's going to have at least half the footprint, maybe even less. But so I'm just really glad you brought up procurement. I think it's a really important space. And it's nice to see circularity start to grow its tendrils into that and see businesses figure out how they can capitalize on the opportunity in their B2B sales too.
So why don't we wrap with two questions here, one for each of you. So for you, Dan, what do you need right now and how can the listeners help support whatever you're up to?
Love the question. Invitation to pander. I think what we need now just for this movement, is more urgency, more of that, like taking the actual action and less exploration. There's to a certain extent, like business to business food transactions. I mean, you can only shorten a sales cycle, for example, so much. But the physical economy, like we're moving things around, and it can take years to take an idea and actually bring it to shelf. And there's a lot of these processes that get caught up in being like ready, but actually not necessarily having launched. For example, and I think at least one aspect of that is this challenge around, the near term, benefit maybe being a little bit more abstract than the long term benefit. It's just so easy to keep with the status quo. And it's just feeding the same system that's going to, make our problems worse, faster. And so I think, one of the things that I really look for as a solution when I'm trying to, when we're trying to work commercially with companies to, bring circularity to life through upcycling, is cross-functional stakeholders at the company. So if we're developing a new food product, I don't want to be just talking. We love talking to food scientists and the product developers, but all our projects are much more successful when someone from another department is also interested in what's happening. And we can have a team of product developers and marketers and procurement people, sustainability professionals, kind of all working together. So I don't know if in this audience we're going to get that broad swath necessarily of cross-functional stakeholders, at different companies, but I really would like to see more the silos kind of broken down and more engagement in these issues, connecting teams that maybe wouldn't work directly together on stuff. And I think this is an area where everyone has a reason to care about this. And if we can just get everyone thinking about the problem at the same time, collaborating, working together, that can be really powerful. And I'd love to see more of that.
And real quick, Dan, do you want to shout out like website or social media or any of those places that folks can find?
Sure. Yeah.
TikTok channel.
Yeah, I've never figured out TikTok. Yeah, upcycledfoods.com is our website. Regrain.com also takes you there. That's our product brand name. And then I'm really easy to find on LinkedIn and everything. Love connecting with people and figuring out how we can help each other, help the world.
Awesome. And you too, Nellie, what do you need right now and how can listeners support what you're up to?
Ooh, gosh. I was hoping I was going to get a different question. No, I'm just kidding. I would say I would encourage consumers to think of themselves as owners and to challenge themselves to be more conscientious in the choices that they make about the things that they purchase and not to be anti-stuff. Like I buy stuff too. We all need stuff. This isn't a negative thing, but to be considerate about what they need, what they want, and that's okay to want things too. The next thing you want, try to buy it used or try to rent it. Try to use an alternative form of acquisition for that next thing that you need or want, or even give it like 10 minutes before you click purchase now. And we all need to do it, myself included. It's a constant reminder because we live in a world where we are intentionally told by brands and retailers that we'll feel better about ourselves if we buy products. So part of it's conscientious consumption. And I think part of it is about cultivating community and meaning in your life outside of consumption too. And that's really important. And I hope everybody, like, going into this time of year where we get to gather and remind ourselves of the communities that we have, that we can draw strength on that, especially through the upcoming holiday season and the Black Fridays and Christmases of the world coming forth.
And Nellie, similar, do you have a website, TikTok channel?
I've never used TikTok, but yes, my website is Work with Baleen. That's BALEEN, workwithbaleen.com. But you can also just find me through LinkedIn, and my website's linked through there too, if that's too long of a name.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Dan, Nellie, it's been a pleasure. And yeah, I really look forward to helping the B Corp community sort of level up on circularity. So thanks for both of you for joining.
Thanks for having us. This is so wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Bee. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts." Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.